October 25, 1944, the Sibuyan Sea. Dawn has not yet broken. In the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0, a young man named Yukio Seki sits with his hands folded in his lap. He does not grip the controls. Not yet. He is 23 years old. He has a wife at home. Her photograph is tucked beneath the instrument panel where a man might once have kept a lucky charm. On the fuselage behind him, someone has written in kanji, Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. Or rather, he has moved past fear into something else, a territory beyond emotion that his culture has a name for, and his commanders have spent weeks constructing. He has been told that his death will be the turning point. That one man, one aircraft, one moment of pure will flung into the steel hull of an American carrier will shift the axis of the war. He believes this. He has to believe it, because if he doesn't, then the entire architecture of sacrifice collapses into something small and terrible. In 4 hours, Yukio Seki will lead the first official Kamikaze unit, the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Corps, into American ships, anchored off Leyte Gulf. He will be the first. He will not be the last, and he will die having struck the escort carrier USS St. Lo, sending it to the bottom of the Leyte Gulf in 18 minutes. But here is what Yukio Seki could not see from his cockpit. What no man in that formation could see. What Japanese Naval Command, in their desperation and their calculation, had not permitted themselves to fully reckon with. On the other side of the Pacific, in the shipyards of Newport News, Virginia, a new Essex-class carrier had been laid down 11 months earlier. It was already in the water. It was already being fitted. Its crew was already being assembled, trained, deployed. And it was not alone. There were 16 more just like it, at various stages of completion across American ports from Maine to California. One carrier sunk, 16 more already built or building. This is not a story about a pilot's courage. It is a story about arithmetic. To understand why Japan turned to the kamikaze, you have to understand how comprehensively the conventional calculus of the Pacific War had been destroyed by the autumn of 1944. In June of that year, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had obliterated the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air power in a single afternoon. American fighter pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was accurate. Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft and 3 carriers in 2 days. It had taken 4 years to train those aviators. It would take 4 more years to replace them. Time Japan did not have. The aircrew that survived the Turkey Shoot were, on average, less than half as experienced as the men who had struck Pearl Harbor in 1941. The gap between American and Japanese pilot quality, never small, had become a chasm. Admiral Seimu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, looked at these numbers and understood something that no communicator Tokyo would ever admit. Japan could no longer win a conventional air battle over the Pacific. The arithmetic was irreversible. American industrial production, already operating at a scale Japan could not approach, had been accelerating since 1942. By 1944, American shipyards were completing an Essex-class fleet carrier every 2 to 3 months. Japan, by contrast, had completed exactly 2 fleet carriers since the war began. Its remaining carriers were being used not as strike platforms, but as decoys, as bait, because they no longer had enough aircraft or pilots to function as anything else. It was Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi who crystallized the new doctrine into a weapon. Onishi was not a reckless man. He was, by the account of those who served under him, an intelligent and often tortured one. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in Japanese command, what the kamikaze represented. He called it a special attack. He never used the word suicide in official communications. He spoke instead of certainty, of transformation, of turning the human body itself into a precision instrument where none other remained. The logic, stripped of its mythology, was this. A conventional Japanese bomber, attacking a defended American carrier group, had a roughly 5% chance of scoring a meaningful hit. The pilot would likely be shot down before he reached his target. But a pilot who intended from the outset to fly his aircraft directly into the ship, who had no need to align for a drop, no need to pull out of the dive, no intention of returning, had a dramatically higher probability of contact. Japanese planners estimated the kamikaze attack rate of effectiveness at around 25% in early planning documents. Some internal memoranda put it higher. They were wrong about the numbers, as it turned out. accurate for early attacks but falling sharply as American anti-aircraft techniques adapted. But the logic itself was sound. A man willing to die is harder to stop than a man trying to survive. What Onishi and Toyota could not build into their calculations was what happened after the hit. An American carrier struck by a kamikaze did not disappear from the order of battle. It went to a repair yard, and American repair yards by 1944 had developed the capacity to return a badly damaged fleet carrier to combat readiness in weeks. The USS Franklin, struck by a kamikaze in October 1944 while operating aircraft, burned for hours and suffered over 700 casualties. It returned to service. The USS Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes in May 1945, lost 393 men. It returned to service. The USS Enterprise was struck 3 times over the course of the campaign. It returned to service. Each time, the logic of the special attack, permanently remove a carrier from the equation, was defeated not by American courage alone, but by American industrial infrastructure. The cranes, the dry docks, the welders working 3 shifts, the spare parts catalogued and pre-positioned, the damage control teams trained to a standard that no other navy in the world had yet achieved. Japan was attacking an organism that could heal faster than it could be cut. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in late October 1944 was the largest naval engagement in human history, by almost any measure. More than 200,000 sailors across hundreds of ships spanning a front of nearly 1,000 miles contested control of the Philippine archipelago over 4 days of continuous fighting. Japan committed nearly its entire remaining surface fleet. It was a gamble on a strategic scale, the last bet placed on a table where every previous bet had been lost. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo, was a masterwork of complexity and a monument to desperation. It involved 4 separate task forces converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions simultaneously. The northern force, built around carriers deliberately stripped of their aircraft, would sail south to draw away the American fast carrier task forces under Admiral Halsey. The center force, the most powerful remaining surface fleet Japan possessed, including the 72,000-ton battleships Yamato and Musashi, would transit the Philippine Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the American invasion fleet from the north. The southern forces would simultaneously approach from the south, through Surigao Strait. It was, in conception, a 3-pronged trap. In execution, it became something else. The center force was attacked continuously by American submarines and carrier aircraft before it ever reached the strait. The Musashi, the largest battleship afloat, absorbed 20 torpedoes and 17 bombs. It took 11 hours for it to sink. When the center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait in the early hours of October 25th, it encountered not the vulnerable fleet it expected, but Task Group 77.4.3. Taffy 3, a collection of escort carriers and destroyers that, by rights, had no business engaging a force of that magnitude. What followed was an act of such desperate and improbable courage that it has obscured, in many historical accounts, the broader strategic reality. Japan's center force, having survived the passage, still could not finish the engagement. It turned back. The reasons are complex and debated. Confusion in command, fear of further air attack, uncertainty about the situation, all contributed to Vice Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw before completing what might have been a devastating blow to the Leyte landing fleet. But the deeper truth is this: even had Kurita pressed his attack and destroyed every ship in the invasion area, the invasion would have continued. American logistics had pre-staged enough material on the beaches to sustain operations independently of naval resupply for weeks. The troops were ashore, the airfields were being constructed, the war had already moved on to the Philippine landmass. Sinking ships in Leyte Gulf would not have reversed that. It was into this context, a battle already decided by logistics before the first kamikaze ignited its engine, that Yukio Seki led his formation south. The first official kamikaze attacks struck American escort carriers on the morning of October 25th. The USS St. Lo was hit at 10:53 a.m. It sank at 11:25, 32 minutes. The USS Kalinin Bay was hit and damaged. The USS Kitkun Bay was hit. The USS White Plains was near missed. In that single morning, the new weapon had demonstrated its claim. A determined pilot in a fuel-laden aircraft could, in fact, sink a ship. The reports that reached Onishi's headquarters produced something close to euphoria. Here at last was a weapon that worked. What the reports did not convey, could not convey, because no one was counting in the right currency, was what was being built on the other side of the ocean in response. In the weeks following Leyte Gulf, the Japanese High Command issued its assessment of the campaign to an increasingly stunned public. The show operation had, in official communiques, been a triumph. Multiple carriers had been sunk, multiple battleships destroyed, the American fleet driven from Philippine waters. None of this was true. But truth, by the autumn of 1944, had become an administrative inconvenience in Tokyo. At the operational level, the men who were actually conducting the Kamikaze campaign knew something different. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, one of the planners at 201st Air Group headquarters who worked closely with Onishi in the weeks after Leyte, would write later that the reaction to early Kamikaze successes was not tactical celebration, but philosophical unease. Onishi himself, by multiple accounts from officers who served under him, spent evenings in his quarters in a condition his staff described as silent and immovable. He had set something in motion that he could not stop, and the returns, even the genuine ones, were telling him something he had not wanted to hear. The arithmetic was already shifting. In the first weeks of kamikaze operations, before American anti-aircraft gunners had calibrated their response, hit rates were as high as 1 in 4 attacking aircraft. By early 1945, as American defensive tactics evolved, combat air patrols vectored by radar at extended range, proximity-fused shells in anti-aircraft batteries that detonated near an aircraft, rather than requiring a direct hit. The hit rate had fallen toward 1 in 10. To sink an Essex-class carrier by kamikaze required, on average, multiple hits. Damaging it required 1. But an American carrier could absorb damage and return to the fight in weeks. To remove a carrier from the Pacific order of battle permanently, Japanese planners would have needed hits of a severity that the kamikaze, with its relatively light aircraft and standardized bomb load, could rarely deliver. A Zero loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb struck with enormous kinetic energy, but American carrier decks were armored. The fires it set could be fought. The holes it tore could be patched. The men it killed could not be replaced. And this was the one domain in which the kamikaze genuinely hurt. But the ships could be. At the front, in the Philippines and later at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the American sailors who survived kamikaze attacks were not broken by them. They were changed. Men who had served in the Atlantic or in conventional Pacific surface engagements described the kamikaze as a different order of experience, not because it was more destructive in aggregate, but because of its nature. A torpedo or a shell burst was impersonal. It came from a distance. The kamikaze looked at you. It chose you. Petty Officer 3rd Class James Fahey, aboard the USS Montpelier, wrote in his diary in December 1944 that watching a kamikaze attack was unlike anything he had experienced in 2 years of Pacific service. The aircraft aimed at the ship the way a man aimed at something. It did not veer. It did not abort. And some of them, as they came in, were already on fire. And they still did not veer. The psychological cost was real and documented. American medical officers at forward naval stations reported increases in psychiatric casualties during periods of intense kamikaze attack. Crews requested rotation at higher rates. Sleep disorders, combat fatigue, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress presented differently when men knew that the threat was not random but directed. Not a weapon fired from a platform, but a platform that was the weapon, guided by a human consciousness until the last second. And yet, the ships kept coming. That is the fact against which everything else must be measured. The psychological toll was real. The ships kept coming anyway. In the Japanese pilot training program, the situation was becoming unsustainable in its own right. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with an elite corps of carrier aviators, some 3,500 first-line pilots, trained to a standard that was, in the early war years, the finest in the world. By the end of 1944, that corps was essentially gone. The men now being recruited into kamikaze units were not highly trained aviators being asked to sacrifice themselves at the peak of their capabilities. They were young men with 10 to 30 hours of total flight time, barely enough to take off reliably, barely enough to navigate to a target, sometimes not enough to control an aircraft in the turbulent conditions over a Pacific Fleet engagement. They were not being wasted. Wasted implies a surplus, They were the last available resource of a military power consuming itself. The central failure of the kamikaze strategy was not a failure of nerve, of execution, or even of tactics. It was a failure of industrial intelligence, a systematic miscalculation about the nature of the opponent Japan was fighting. Japanese planners had built their doctrine on a model of American industrial capacity that was already outdated by the time the war began. They had studied American production statistics from the late 1930s, before the mobilization of 1940 to 1941 had transformed the economy. What they had not fully modeled, what their intelligence apparatus had not conveyed with sufficient clarity, was the rate at which American manufacturing had accelerated under wartime conditions. Consider the numbers. In 1941, American shipyards produced approximately 1.2 million tons of naval shipping. In 1943, that figure exceeded 18 million tons. The Essex-class carrier program alone accounted for 24 hulls ordered, with 17 completed and commissioned before the war's end. Each Essex-class carrier displaced approximately 27,000 tons and carried 90 aircraft. The program that began with US Essex in 1942 did not slow as the war progressed. It accelerated. New construction techniques borrowed from civilian commercial shipbuilding, prefabricated sections, assembly line approaches to outfitting, standardized components, cut construction time from the pre-war standard of roughly 3 years to under 18 months for later hulls. Japanese naval intelligence understood, in broad terms, that American production was large. What they did not understand, what perhaps no one in Tokyo had the institutional architecture to process, was that American production was not just large, but responsive. When a ship was sunk, replacement authorization moved through naval procurement in days, not months. When a new threat emerged, the kamikaze, American industry adapted within weeks. The proximity-fused anti-aircraft shell, which detonated when it passed within lethal range of an aircraft rather than requiring a direct hit, had been in development since 1940. It was deployed to Pacific Fleet units in 1943. By 1944, it was standard equipment on every major surface combatant in the theater. This single munition, produced in the tens of millions by American factories, reduced kamikaze effectiveness by an estimated 30 to 40% by the calculations of post-war analysts. Japan had no equivalent and no capacity to develop one in the time remaining. The contrast in logistics was equally stark. American fleet operations in the Pacific by 1944 were supported by a mobile logistics system of extraordinary capability, the fleet train, a permanent underway replenishment force that could refuel, rearm, and resupply fleet carriers without requiring them to return to port. When the fast carrier task forces of Task Force 38 were operating off the Philippines, they were being refueled at sea from fleet oilers, restocked with aircraft from escort carriers serving as mobile airfields, and supplied with ammunition and food from supply ships that met them at designated points while they continued operations. The effective operational radius of the American fleet, for all practical purposes, was unlimited. Japan had no equivalent system. Japanese fleet units operating in the Philippines were already at the margins of their supply lines. Fuel was the critical constraint. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, burned approximately 600 tons of fuel per day at cruising speed. Japanese oil production in the home islands had been largely replaced by refined petroleum from the Dutch East Indies, oil that had to travel, by tanker, through waters increasingly controlled by American submarines. By October 1944, Japan was routing its military oil through the Linga Roads anchorage in the Dutch East Indies, specifically to be closer to its fuel sources, because moving its fleet to Japanese home waters and then back to the theater of operations would have consumed more fuel than it could spare. The operational geography of the Japanese Navy had been determined by its fuel supply. This is not a detail. This is the shape of the war. Against this background, the kamikaze made a certain desperate sense. Pilots required no return fuel. Missions could be flown by barely trained aviators because the terminal maneuver required less skill than a conventional attack. Aircraft unsuitable for combat, old Zeros, obsolete bombers, trainers, could be loaded with bombs and fuel and directed toward a carrier group. The inefficiency of the conventional air power Japan could no longer field was, in a kamikaze, partially circumvented. But none of this changed the fundamental equation. The kamikaze could damage American ships. It could not replace them. And Japan, with each passing month, had fewer aircraft, Fewer pilots, less fuel, less steel, and less time. In April 1945, the largest kamikaze operation of the war was launched against the American fleet, anchored off Okinawa. Operation Kikusui, Floating Chrysanthemums, dispatched nearly 1,500 aircraft in a series of 10 mass attacks over the course of 3 months. The attacks began on April 6th and continued until late June. American ships at Okinawa were struck repeatedly, damaged severely, and occasionally sunk. The destroyer USS Laffey was struck by 4 kamikazes and 6 bombs within 80 minutes and remained afloat. The USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds of each other, killing 393 men and setting fire to aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance on its flight deck. It sailed under its own power to Puget Sound for repairs. In total, Operation Kikusui sank 26 American vessels and damaged more than 200. It killed approximately 5,000 American sailors and wounded another 5,000. These are not trivial numbers. They represent the most sustained and damaging special attack operation in the history of naval warfare. During the same period, April through June 1945, American shipyards completed and commissioned 7 new fleet carriers, 11 escort carriers, and dozens of smaller combat vessels. The repair yards at Puget Sound, Pearl Harbor, Ulithi, and Leyte Gulf returned damaged ships to service at a rate that, at the operational level, more than compensated for Kikusui's toll. The total number of operational American carrier aircraft available to Pacific Fleet commanders did not decrease during the 3 months of Kikusui. It increased. Onishi Takijiro, who had conceived the divine wind and who bore the weight of it in ways that his public demeanor concealed, survived the war by less than a day. On August 16, 1945, the day after Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announcing surrender, he committed ritual suicide in his Tokyo quarters. He left no final statement about the strategy he had built. His aide found a poem. Historians have argued about its meaning. His death, by the method he chose, was itself a commentary on the gap between what the kamikaze was supposed to accomplish and what it did. The kamikaze killed approximately 7,000 American sailors across the Pacific campaign and wounded more than twice that number. It damaged or sank more than 400 American vessels. In the narrow frame of tactical accounting, these are significant results for a weapon improvised under extreme duress. But the frame that matters is the strategic one, and in that frame, the verdict is not complicated. Japan launched approximately 2,800 kamikaze sorties during the Battle of Okinawa alone, consuming in the process a significant portion of its remaining aircraft, trained pilots, and aviation fuel. The cumulative attrition of this campaign, not just at Okinawa but across the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and the approaches to the home islands, did not delay the American advance by a single week according to post-war operational assessments. The invasion timeline was driven by logistics and weather, not by Japanese resistance. The aircraft Japan consumed in kamikaze operations against the fleet could not then be used to defend the home islands. By the time Allied planners were finalizing Operation Downfall, the invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, Japanese aviation assets in the home islands had been reduced to approximately 5,000 aircraft, held in reserve for that final defense. Every zero expended against Okinawa was a zero that would not meet the landing craft off Kagoshima. The photograph of Yukio Seki, taken the morning before his final mission, shows a young man in a flight suit looking directly at the camera. He is not smiling. His face is composed in the way that men compose their faces when they are trying to look like what they believe they should be. He led his formation south that morning because he was told it would matter, because the mathematics, as presented to him, suggested that it could turn the tide. The mathematics he was given were wrong, not because his commanders lied, though they did habitually as the Pacific campaign progressed and the losses mounted, but because the calculation they were making was itself based on a fundamental error. They were measuring the impact of what they could destroy. They were not measuring the rate at which what they destroyed would be replaced. That rate, the American rate of production, repair, and replacement, was not a tactical variable. It was not something that could be influenced by a different type of aircraft, a bolder attack profile, a larger initial strike. It was the product of decisions made a decade earlier about industrial investment, workforce training, raw material access, and national infrastructure. By 1944, it had become, in the most literal sense of the word, unstoppable. not because of any single strategic decision, but because of 10,000 accumulated decisions about steel mills and shipyard cranes and welding techniques and labor agreements and railway logistics that predated the war by years. The Kamikaze was Japan's answer to a question it could not afford to ask. What do you do when the opponent's capacity exceeds your ability to diminish it? The answer, it turned out, was nothing. 16 weeks after Yukio Seki flew south over the Sibuyan Sea, the USS Essex, which had been at sea continuously launching and recovering aircraft since its commissioning, returned to Pearl Harbor for routine maintenance. It had not been sunk. It had not been permanently damaged. Its crew of 3,400 men had been rotated, its aircraft replenished, its ammunition restocked. It was, functionally, the same ship, doing the same work as if the divine wind had never blown. In the dry docks of Newport News and Bremerton and Camden and Bethlehem Steel's yards at Quincy, the work continued. Hulls rose from keel blocks. Welders worked by arc light through the night. Men were trained in the procedures of ship handling, of damage control, of anti-aircraft gunnery, of carrier operations. The machinery of American industrial production, once fully engaged, did not pause for grief, did not pause for ideology, did not pause for the sacrifice of 2,800 young men in fuel-laden aircraft over the waters of the Philippine Sea. It simply built more ships, and that, more than any battle, more than any decision in any flag plot, more than any act of courage or desperation on either side, was what decided the Pacific War.